My name is Irene Ovonji Odida. I'm from Uganda. I'm a member of the Becky High-Level Panel on Illicit Financial Flows from Africa. It's a panel set up by the African Union and ECA in 2012 to look at the phenomenon of IFS from Africa. And apart from that, I engage as part of some other organizations like Tax Justice Network, ICRIT, which is the Independent Commission for Reform of International Corporate Taxation, and Pan-African Lawyers Union, which has a task force on illicit financial flows. You could call me a one-note person right now, but I'm really passionate about illicit financial flows and ending that from Africa. It's really about looking at the resources that Africa loses annually, year on year, and which drain the continent of resources. Just a quick, information about that. The report that we did as the Mbeki panel in 2015 found that Africa by then was losing about $50 billion per annum to illicit financial flows, and that was an undercount. It's a conservative estimate because the nature of the activities that lead to it make IFFs a hidden issue. So you can't estimate all of it and quantify the whole amount. And by 2020, when UNCTAD did a similar study in Africa, the figures had grown from the $50 billion per annum that we found to $88.6 billion per annum lost. So it's a big issue, and the estimate now, one could say, could be about $100 billion lost every year. The discussion today in this meeting organized by Akina Mama is quite useful. It's an important discussion because it's looking at issues that relate to IFFs and relate to economic justice. Because the fundamental issue for Africa is about its relationship with the rest of the world, and particularly with the global north, through practices like tax and trade, diplomacy, and so on. So all these different things, debt. So this discussion is looking at all of that. So it's a big picture that you have to look at. So you have to think about macroeconomics at a broad level, and what kind of structures exist globally, and what are the pillars of the global economic system that contribute to a relationship where Africa is extracted from and cannot meet its development objectives or agendas, in spite of being, in my view, the wealthiest continent in the world. And the wealth of Africa is not just the minerals and extractives that most of us think about, but things like arable land, like water, other natural resources, the culture, the peoples. We're a very resilient people, in spite of everything that has been thrown at Africa for the past maybe 500 years. So we're a very rich continent. But in spite of that, you find that when looking at the so-called development indices, Africa's counted as being at the bottom of everything. I actually don't agree with that. I think we have to change our mindset and have our own ways of measuring what development is, and also measuring where we are in that equation. So things like social relationships. In Africa, you won't hear about an old person dumped in an old person's home, because the family will take care of their own, and those kind of social ties. Some things are beginning to happen now, like depression and suicide. We never used to have that. So those are things that are not counted when we talk about development. They should be. But if you look at how the world measures development, with GDP and stuff like that, we're at the bottom, in spite of the wealth that we have. So this discussion is very useful because it helps us to think about the big picture and not to look at the specific issues each participant is working on in a silo. So if one is working on say, debt, to look at how does debt connect to austerity, or how does it connect to illicit flows? How does it connect to global taxation? And how does it connect to macroeconomic policies? So it's a useful meeting for that. It's also good because it brings together people from different sectors. So I'm retired, but my background has been, I've been in civil society. I've worked in government in the past. I've also been a legislator. So I've been in all these different sectors, and I see in the room people from all those different spaces. And it helps us to see how do we engage across the silos in terms of the issues and the sectors? Well, a core thing for me is about collaboration. What we're dealing with, it's a political issue, it's an economic issue, but it's fundamentally political because where we are at is based on decisions made, it's based on geopolitics, it's based on power. So if one wants to change a situation that arises from choices made by those with power, then how you organize becomes important. How you conceptualize becomes important. So what needs to happen for me is at multiple levels. At the individual level of the individuals in the room and the organizations and spaces that they come from, we have to think about deepening our knowledge and our understanding of what is causing the problem Africa has right now, and how do we harness the strength, the riches that Africa has. How do we understand Africa differently? So understanding the history of Africa and looking at some of the sources that are not typically taught in our curriculum. I'm thinking about people like the late Professor Diop, Cheikh Anta Diop from Senegal, who was a polyglot, and he did research using so many different disciplines, maybe 10 or 11 disciplines that he mastered, including linguistics, including biology, chemistry, history, geography, and so on, archaeology, all of that to show the true history of Africa, not the history that we're taught coming from the colonial system. So understanding who we are and the strengths that we have as a continent is a task that each of us has to take up. Read from the right sources, understand the world, not the propaganda that is put out by primarily global northern outlets. So there is a task of that sort, and then that helps us to have better consciousness about the world and have a better worldview, and then deepen the work that we're doing. So that's at a personal or institutional level. The other thing is the nature of the task. For me, I define it as the injustice of the global economic system. That's a huge thing. No one organization, no one government can dismantle that on their own. So this work needs collaboration, and collaboration based on the strengths, the networks, the resources each one can bring, from communities to countries to governments. So building those networks is another part of what we need to do from this meeting. See, how do we collaborate better, and how do we collaborate in a way that addresses our fundamental issues that we need to resolve as Africa. Essentially, we need to go back to the Pan-African mode that we had and shift away from what has become so pervasive now. The dominant thinking today is very neoliberal, where everything is about money and profit and commodities. But not only that, we're doing that in a continent that has been so penetrated by the global north. I'll give you an example. When they talk about private sector, people just rattle out private sector-led growth. Who is the private sector in Africa? And if you think about the large private sector in the most profitable spaces, it's multinationals. The small businesses run by locals are very micro, and yet the policy support and subsidies, the tax exemptions and things like that, don't go to them. They aren't even looked at as investors. When we talk about investors, we're always thinking about the multinationals. But the multinationals have an agenda which is really about profit and getting profit out. We forget as Africa that capital has a nationality. So, we need to rethink what our space is and come up with ways of working that are relevant to our context. So for me, that's the task ahead of us. Lastly, I would say is to work at different levels. So we need to strengthen how we engage at regional level, including strengthening the AU and how it engages, and then coming with a common African position, in my case on tax reform, looking at the UN negotiations on a UN convention on taxation, And so having a common African position that is used to steer how we engage internationally. All of that for me needs to be geared, driven by recognizing that illicit financial flows are a major problem. I'll say one last thing. When we did our report as the Mbeki panel, the figure I mentioned where now it's about $100 billion lost per year to IFFs, we found that 65% of the IFFs are lost through commercial practices. So through tax and trade abuse, things like tax avoidance and abuse of bad agreements, bad concessionary agreements, say in the mining sector or other natural resources. So many of these are not even illegal. And only 30% of losses were found to be from criminal activity, organized crime, trafficking, money laundering, tax evasion, and just 5% from corruption. So the IFFs is a big issue, and we need to target the tax and trade element or the commercial drivers of it. I'll just say it's been a beautiful time together to refresh, and we hope and we should plan that we will take the work forward after this.